Hey guys and gals, what is up? Welcome, or indeed welcome back to my first tutorial. You heard me right, this is my first tutorial, my first official tutorial. That is, today we're going to be doing something very fun, very cool, very interesting, and that is chunky. Take a look at my background here. This is Minecraft green field, but this is looking a little bit more than your average Minecraft screenshot. That is right, this was made in a program called Chunky. Chunky is a Minecraft rendering program that makes really cool images. I'm going to show you a couple more here. Here's one of Chicago. That is Minecraft Chicago, made by Alex. And by golly, that's incredible looking. This was all made in Chunky. Let me find you some more. Here's one of Greenfield, the port. Very interesting. These are all made in Chunky. Here's another one that I made for Greenfield, the 0.5.2 update last year. Here's my desktop background. Very cool. I'm telling you, this is next level Minecraft screenshots that Chunky is able to do. And today I'm going to be doing a tutorial pretty much going over the entire program. This is going to be a very long video, so I'm hoping to make it very much in depth. But we are actually going to jump right into today's video. The tutorial, first up, I'm going to show you how to download it. There's a couple of things that I want you to know. First up, head over to this link here. I'll have that down in the description. So we're going to go ahead and head over to that link, and this link will take you to the Chunky homepage. This is where you download Chunky. This is the only website that you should use to download Chunky. There are other unofficial versions, but this is the official download page. So first up, you can see this is the homepage. We're going to want to go ahead and head over to the Downloads tab, and as you can see, we have quite a few options to download Chunky. Now, one thing that I do want you guys to know, if you are rendering on a world that is, say, 1.12, 1.11, 1.10, anything that is older than 1.13, you want Chunky 1.4.5. You want Chunky 1.4.5, and that can be obtained by these three downloads here. Of course, realize that you need to get your respective operating system version. So if you want the Mac Chunky for 1.4.5, you want this little guy. If you're doing it on Linux, you want this little link right here. If you're doing it on Windows, you want this right here. However, if you want to render a world that is, say, on 1.14, 1.13, 1.15 even, you're going to want the launcher only. This will download the proper version for those newer Minecraft worlds. Chunky 1.4.5 does not work on Minecraft worlds that are older than 1.13. Today I'm going to be doing the Chunky 2.0, as it is so called, that does these newer Minecraft worlds. So the tutorial is different for these. I'm not going to be doing these. I'm only going to be doing Chunky 2.0 today. So we're going to go ahead and download that. It will download as a .jar. Windows doesn't like those, but you can go ahead and keep it. It is safe to keep. And we're all done on this page. Next up, we're going to go ahead and head to our downloads folder, which is right here. If you don't know how to get to that, just go ahead and go to this PC, downloads, and then right there is the Chunky launcher. Now I'm going to drag this to my desktop. It doesn't matter where it is. My personal Chunky directory is right here on my C drive. As you can see, I have a whole bunch of files there. Your Chunky drive can be wherever you'd like, but I strongly recommend making a folder for it to install everything in. I'm just going to title this folder Chunky Tutorial. Excuse me, I can't type. Chunky Tutorial. Like so, and you can go ahead and drop the Chunky launcher in there. And as you can see, it is now in our folder. Now, before we go into anything, whether that be setting up or anything like that, I wanted to go over a couple of system requirements for you to know. First up, I strongly recommend that you have 16 gigabytes of RAM for you to run Chunky. It allows you to select much larger areas. If you don't have 16 gigabytes of RAM, that's all right. You just won't be able to select as many areas. Having 16 gigabytes of RAM does indeed help your rendering experience a lot, and of course the more RAM you get, the better your experience is going to be, and the more chunks you will be able to select. In terms of CPU, I have an 8-core processor. That definitely helps. It's an 8-core Intel processor, but really any processor that is, well, somewhat new will greatly help you. Basically, the faster and newer and more cores your processor has, the faster your renders will go, but that's not as needed as, say, RAM. Now, to jump right in, we're going to go ahead and launch this. You can see we have it in our Chunky tutorial folder. All you have to do is just double click and go ahead and run it. Now, as you can see, it will ask you to set up first time. it will ask you the directory that you want it to be in. We're going to be making the directory this folder right here. So as you can see, this option down on the bottom, the working directory, will allow you to basically fill in all of the cache things and the save files all in your folder. So we're going to go ahead and use the working directory. That's where our .jar is. Your working directory is where your .jar is. So go ahead and click Use Selected Directory. And as you can see, it is starting to build all the files right here. And you're going to be greeted by the first time launcher. Now, there is one thing that I want you to do right now. Pause everything and go ahead and head down to the description of this video. I have a update server link, a server link, so you can download a new version of Chunky. Now, I'm going to go ahead and copy this right here. Now, let me explain what this is. Essentially, the person who makes Chunky, his name is Elbit. Elbit is no longer working on Chunky, at least for now. He's busy with college things. Instead, the gentleman, or woman, I'm not sure, but the person who is making Chunky is named Lee-Make. Not sure, but basically they are continuing Chunky and making it updated for Minecraft 1.14, 1.15. So like I said, if you want those newer versions, you're going to want to get this update site here. And as you can see, like I did, you can see here I have the Chunky launcher. Go ahead under Advanced Settings, click that, and you'll see right here, Update Site. Go ahead and highlight this, delete the update site that's already in there by default, and paste the link that I have in the description. And next up, we're going to go ahead and click Check for Update right up here. Go ahead and click that, and there usually is an update. This is pretty much every week or so there's an update. As you can see, we have a couple of things that have been updated. Go ahead and click Update to New Version. It will download the version. These usually aren't that big. You can go ahead and close that out. We're not going to be launching Chunky. I have a couple of things that I want to go over with you. Next up is RAM. Your memory limit, that is also your RAM. Now I have a whopping 64 gigabytes of RAM. Most people don't have that, but that's okay. The memory limit is how much RAM you want Chunky to use. If you have 16, I recommend doing something like 15,000. You can go ahead and type that in. As you can see, we now have 15,000 megabytes of RAM that it will use. If you do have more RAM, say you have 32 gigabytes of RAM, you can do something like 30,000 megabytes. We're not going to hit enter, but as you can see now, the memory limit is 30,000 megabytes. For today's video, I'm just going to be sticking to a 16,000 megabyte limit because that's what most people have. Some people anyway. And that's okay if you don't have that, but if you're financially able to, having more RAM for Chunky is definitely better. Other than that, your settings directory, that just opens up pretty much just this. You don't need to mess around with too much of this stuff. If it can't find your Java, Chunky does need Java, just like Minecraft. You can go ahead and choose where your Java is installed, usually under Program Files and then Java, and you can go ahead and select that folder, and it's right there. We're not going to mess around with that too much because mine is already selected, and we're ready to go. Excuse me. Once you have all those settings in place, you can go ahead and launch. Once we launch, you can see that there is lots of white lines with black lines, and that is okay because there is no world currently in Chunky. This is what your first time setup will look like. To do so, we're going to go up here in the top right hand corner and click Change World. We're going to go ahead and click Change World Directory. Now, by default, it is in fact in the .minecraft saves folder. I certainly hope that you have a .minecraft folder. If you don't, well then you're out of luck. Now, I didn't say this earlier in the video, but Chunky is specifically designed for Minecraft. This is not any rendering program. This is specifically for Minecraft. The world I'm going to be rendering today is Greenfield 0.5.3. I'm sure if you ever see this video in a later date, you'll see, oh wow, that is a really old version of Greenfield. We're currently sitting around June 2020, the 10th, so maybe that'll show how dated this video will get at some point in time, but now this is the current version of Greenfield, and as you can see, I'm just moving around right here. I'm using my left mouse button to click and drag. I essentially click and then drag my mouse button, and that allows you to move around the world. This is your chunk selection map view. This is where you select all your chunks, and this is what allows you to move around the world, find out where you want your selection to be. Now, one of the things that I do want to give you a little hint here is if you'd like to load a custom texture pack, go ahead and go over to Options And as you can see, there's this little button here that says Edit Resource Packs. Go ahead and click that. And as you can see, you can go ahead and click Add. And this will allow you to select a texture pack. Now, we're going to be doing the Greenfield texture pack, the 1.14 version. It only works for .zips as far as I know. So if you have a .zip texture pack, not a folder, but instead a .zip, go ahead and open that. And go ahead and select it and click Apply. Now, you will want to do this before you start rendering. That's why I told you to do that before we start selecting chunks. If you need help reloading your chunks, as you can see, some of them don't seem to be loading in. That is okay. Go ahead and click Chunks up here. Excuse me, wrong button. Go ahead and click Map View and click Reload Chunks. As you can see, now it is reloading chunks that have the texture pack applied. Applied. Bit of a voice crack there. And now you can start making your selection. If you don't need to load a texture pack, that's fine. All you have to do is just select chunks, and I'm going to teach you how to do that right now. So we're going to find an area, or let's say right here. I like this building here on Greenfield. And as you can see, I just selected a chunk. The chunks are in red. So if you have a red area on your screen, I just selected 9 chunks. As you can see, they're 3x3 grid. There's 9 chunks here. These red squares are the Minecraft chunks. This is the actual chunks in the world. That's why Chunky is called, well, Chunky, because it deals with Minecraft chunks. That's how it reads the program, and as you can see, it's these little 16x16 blocks. Now, if you want to select an area bigger than this, you're going to want to go ahead and click down with your mouse button and click Shift. Other way around. You want to click Shift on your keyboard and then click your left mouse button and drag. This will select an area that allows you to drag, as you can see here. We're going to go ahead and select this area. Go ahead and click Shift again and drag. Go ahead and click Shift and drag. And now we have an area selected. Now, if you want to select more than that, you can go ahead and zoom out using your mouse wheel. As you can see, I'm zooming in and out. And once I get out so far, I have a massive area of chunks that I can select. It's huge. Be warned when you select this many chunks, because the more chunks you select, the more RAM you use. If you don't have a whole lot of RAM, you probably won't be able to do these big selections, and you'll only be able to do these little areas here. But that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. You can go ahead, and I'm going to go ahead and select an area like so. And once you have your area selected and you're happy with that, go ahead and use your right mouse button, right click, and press New Scene from Selection. This will start the loading up process, and this will give you your render view. Now, just be warned again that this will take some more of your CPU, and you'll see my RAM usage go up as it loads in these chunks. And once we're in, we're in. And as you can see, I can now move around the scene. This looks very similar to Minecraft, and this is the viewpoint here that you will use to set up your render. This is what your render will look like. Anything that you see in the scene, this is pretty much what your render will look like. So there's a lot of stuff to explain here. The first thing that I want to do first, this is not something that you have to do, but I will go over it. My CPU utilization. Guys, I'm using OBS right now. That uses a lot of your CPU. I'm going to be bumping this down. I've had issues in the past with my video has not been able to encode fast enough and my audio cut out. This is actually my 3rd time doing this tutorial, but my audio has cut out and it's just not been a very pleasant thing. So I'm going to set my CPU utilization to 30%. That means Chunky will only use 30% of my CPU. I strongly advised against doing this, because the less of your CPU Chunky uses, the longer your render will take. But I wanted to do that way I can give you a quality tutorial. So next up, we're going to go ahead and move around here. It seems to be lagging a little bit, but that's okay. I had to really quickly restart Chunky. It was having a little bit of a hiccup, but that's okay. We are back and ready to go. Like I said earlier, this is like Minecraft. To move around your scene, you're going to want to go ahead and click your left mouse button somewhere in this little square here. And to move forward, you want to go ahead and press W. To move back, you want to press S. To move left is A. And to move right is D. To go ahead and move your camera around like I am, simply again click within the scene and start dragging your left mouse button around to sort of, dive in and out. You can see that I'm dragging clicking with my left mouse button and dragging my cursor all around while pressing W. As you can see, I can move all around the scene here. Like I said earlier too, whatever you see in this scene is what your final render will look like. Now, this is what your left side panel is going to look like. I missed this earlier in the video, but basically you don't have to touch any of this, any of the left-hand side options when you're in this view. You only want to focus on the right-hand side. When you are in this view, you really only want to focus on this side and not on the right-hand side. So I'm going to be going through these options here, one by one. This is probably will take up the majority of the video, but that's okay because I want it to be very in-depth. So first up, the Scene tab. Simply click on the tabs to expand them. There's a good amount of important settings in here. The first up that I really want you to focus on, but I don't want you to change yet, is the canvas size. As you can see, you have a couple of options here. This is what your final render will look like, and once I change the size of this, as you can see, it will update it to make it 1080p. This is what the picture will be like. And it does take a while to update, like I said, but once it does, it will be a 1080p image. Whenever you are done setting up the rest of the options here, you want to change the canvas size. But for most people, including myself, you want to leave your canvas size on 400 by 400 because it is far easier to move around and position your scene. It requires a lot less compute power to render everything that you see in this scene. That option is very important though, and the next options are up here. You can see, I'm not going to be going through these ones in very good detail, except for these bottom two, but your open scene directory, that's where your scene is saved. If you click that, it will open up your scene directory. I'm not sure where mine is, but it should open it up. Next up is export settings. You can see where it exports your settings to. This is the settings JSON. That is what your settings file looks like for Chunky. Your import settings. This is basically the settings that you want to import. Chunky saves your settings for your render as a .json, kind of more complicated stuff. Next up is load selected chunks. If you're in your scene and you're like, well, you know, I need more chunks loaded. You can see if we get it moving here, you can see in the background there's a couple of white areas. If you head on over to the map view, and you can see that, well, maybe you want to select some more chunks over here. Go ahead and click Shift again and drag and select some more chunks. Now head back over to the render view and go ahead and click Load Selected Chunks. This will load those chunks, and it will then appear right in the back. If you watch carefully, once the preview is done rendering out, some of those chunks will appear back there. That's what the Load Selected Chunks option does. If we can get our render to move here. And then next up is the Reloading Chunks option. This option allows you to reload chunks if there's any errors or anything like that. As you can see, when the preview updated, you can see those chunks that I did not previously have selected is now selected in the back there. This allows you to select chunks as you go, and if you want to select a lot of chunks but you don't have a lot of memory, it allows you to figure out which chunks you can select and which chunks you cannot. Reload chunks, as you can see down at the bottom, it will quickly reload your chunks, like I said, if there's any error or anything like that. Once your chunks are reloaded, you can pretty much let this scene tab go until the very end. Next up is lighting. The lighting tab is very important and something that you will be messing around with quite often. First up is the skylight. Now, as I drag this, you can see that the skylight will get less and less. This is very important if you want to do like a nice nighttime scene. You probably want to have around like 0.3. If I render it out here, you can see that once it starts rendering that the skylight is a little darker. If I reset that and make the skylight a lot lighter, you will see that it gets a lot lighter. As you can see, you can make some cool render effects with that, but that's something that I don't touch too much. There are more important and more accurate settings, so we're going to go ahead and set that to about maybe 1.1 is good. Something along those lines. Now, the next up that's far more important than skylight is emitters. Now, I need to find a light post here because I need to show you what emitters do. As you can see, this is a piece of glowstone with the greenfield texture pack installed. I have it. You can see my cursors on it. It is sort of in my field of view. This piece of glowstone, if I render this puppy out, it will not light up. As you can see, there's no light coming from that guy. That's okay though, that's because emitters is not turned on. I usually do turn on emitters when I have my, when I render out an image. But the emitter intensity, that shows you how strong the emitters are. If I bump it down to, say, 1, I usually do that for daytime shots around a 1.1, 1.2 for the emitter intensity, and as you can see, well, the emitter is now turned on. If I bump that up to, say, 10 or maybe even 20, and I start rendering that, you can see that it gets a lot brighter. You can see over to the side here that the piece of glowstone is now emitting a lot of light. That is what emitters do. The more emitters you have in your scene, the longer it takes to render out. You could see there that it did get a little grainy. That's because Chunky, that's just the way Chunky renders, and that's pretty much the way any rendering program renders. The more lights you have in your scene, the longer it will take. So just be careful when you're adjusting that setting. If you're doing a nighttime shot, you probably want to do it higher, maybe close to 20, maybe even as high as 50 or 60. Again, the great thing about Chunky is it all depends on what you like. If you like what you see, then keep doing what you'd like. It's all up to you. There are as many options to control what your scene looks like. Next up, enable sunlight. You can turn that off if you so like. What that means is that there is no sunlight. So there is pretty much no shadows. Now I'm going to go ahead and reset that render because I don't want my audio cutting out again. But basically, enable sunlight means there's no shadows. That's a setting that you can play around with if you'd like to do a nighttime shot, but usually I leave that on. Next up is sun intensity. It's by default 1.25. That's a pretty good option. For that, I tell you that you can do whatever you want with Chunky, but in all reality, if you do a sun intensity that's closer to 2, if I render that out here, you'll see that it gets kind of not so realistic. You can see it's super, super bright. Not the most realistic, but of course if you do something like 0.2 or 0.3, you can see that it's also not the most realistic if you're going for a daytime shot. If you're going for a nighttime shot, sun intensity is great around like 0.3, 0.2. For today's render, I'm going to be leaving it at about 1. And next up is the sun azimuth and sun altitude. Now, right up there, that little guy right there, that is our sun. Now watch him as I move the sun azimuth around. As you can see, he moves around quite a lot, and the sun azimuth is the angle that the sun is to the north. If you ever get confused and you don't know what a specific setting does, you can hold your cursor over the words. You can see it gives you a little tooltip. It says change the angle of the sun from the north, or in relation to the north. As you can see, as I move this little scrolly wheel around, my sun should at some point in time move around. Again, it does take a little bit to let this image process here. Sun altitude. And of course, there it goes. Sun altitude, this is how high or low your sun is. So if I lower it down, you can see that it gets a nice morning shot, perhaps an evening shot. It can be whatever you'd like. If I raise it up here, you can see that it will be maybe a 10 o'clock or so sunshine. That allows you to move your sun all around in altitude. You want to use these in conjunction to each other because they do allow you to position the sun wherever you'd like in the sky. Next up is sun color. Sun color is very important. It means what color your sun looks like when the sunlight hits the ground. If you want a really bluish tint to your scene, you can go ahead and set the sun color to be a blue. If I render that out here, you'll see that the scene on the ground will get a nice bluish tint. I need to let that render out there for a moment. As you can see, it is starting, and as you can see, everything's got a blue tint. If you don't like that color, you can do pretty much any color that you'd like. I like a nice yellow. During a daytime shot, I usually do a very, very mild yellow. You can go ahead and save that, and I'll show you what that looks like. If I let that render out here, as you can see, there is a very slight yellow tint. By default, it is white. Maybe that doesn't always look the best, but again, Chunky allows you to customize your picture however you like. If you like a blue, that's okay. If you like a green, that's okay too. It's all up to you. That is it for the lighting tab. The next thing we're going to be moving on to is the sky and fog tab. Now, as you saw earlier in the video, Chunky does try its best to render out a nice sky, like a morning shot. If you ever do something like that, it was over here. But there's many ways to get a little more advanced. Now, simulated sky, that pretty much looks exactly like this. It's chunky trying to make the sky look nice and pretty. It can look okay. It's up to you, again. But for me personally, I like to do sky maps. If I can see the sky, I like to do a sky map, and the way to do that is to go ahead and click Sky Mode, and then scroll down to Sky Map Panoramic. This will allow you to select a file, and we're going to go ahead and click Load Sky Map. And as you can see, I have to find my Sky Map directory. You can find these on Google if you so please. I have a bunch saved already. This is something that you find with experience. But pretty much as long as it looks like, let me go show you some examples really quickly of what they have to look like for it to be correct. They have to have this nice curve. You can see, let me load one up here. As you can see, this doesn't look like a normal sky map. It's kind of curved and distorted, but when you load it up into Chunky, if I go ahead and find one here, we're going to go ahead and do this one. When I load it up into Chunky, you will see that it looks quite normal. That's because Chunky takes that projection and sort of wraps it around the world. And once everything renders out here, you'll see that you'll have a very beautiful sky. As you can see, once your sky map is loaded up, you have a very realistic looking sky. If you position this correctly, you can see that it looks fantastic. If I go ahead and render it out, this is what your sky map looks like. This is how people get those realistic looking Minecraft images. They look absolutely fantastic. If I move around the scene more, you can see that there is many different skies. Now, your sun does get a little whack. It no longer looks nice and rendered and smooth. It's just a big square, so you probably don't want that in your scene. That's just something to know. You can change the sky map rotation. If I move this around here, you can see it moving in the scene. It looks almost, that's actually a very cool effect. You can see it moving all around. You can rotate it to how you like. Next up, we're not going to be messing around with these settings too much because not too many people do clouds. If you would like to do clouds, you can certainly figure out how to do that on yourself. It's not too hard. You can change the cloud size, the cloud X, Y, and Z. The next setting that I'm going to be talking to you about is fog density. Now, this is very important. Our scene currently has no fog. That is okay. It looks fantastic either way. But if you would like to do fog, there is a very specific amount of fog that you need to do for different effects. You can see down here this hint. Set fog density greater than 0.1 for thick fog and less than 0.1 for a haze effect. If you would like a slight haze, 0.1 will not get you that. I recommend something like 0.005 per se. Now, if we start rendering that up, you can see what that looks like. It will give you a nice, thicker fog for a nice haze effect. As you can see, it is kind of in the back there. It looks almost like a very summer sky, so to speak, right before a rainstorm. One of those hot summer days. I'm sure you know what I mean. But that is how you adjust the fog. If you want to do a very, very thin layer, you can do something like 0.01. We let that render out. You can see what that looks like. A lot of Chunky is just playing around with different settings, figuring out what looks best. If you would like to do even less fog than that, go ahead and do 0.0005. It's all up to you. Oops, we want 5. It's all up to you. Again, play around with it, see what looks best. As you can see, there's still a good amount of fog there. If you'd like to change the fog color, go ahead and click that box. You can see you can change the fog color to whatever you want, just like with the sunlight. If you'd like to do a bit of a, say, a smoggy feel, you can go ahead and select a gray. Go ahead and click save, and we're going to render that out and see what that looks like. As you can see, that actually does look like a lot like either a smoggy sky or perhaps a hot summer day right before it rains. Again, Chunky gives you so many controls to do what you'd like. If you want thick fog, you can go ahead and crank that sucker up, paying attention to the little hint down here. If you do something like 0.8, I'm going to show you what that looks like. It's very, very foggy, so just, again, be careful with how much you apply the fog. That's it for sky and fog. We're going to be moving on next to the water, and I'm going to go ahead and move on over to a water area. As you can see here, there is some water in my scene. We're going to go ahead and mess around with those settings right now. I want to turn off fog because we need to see what's happening with the water here. First up, still water. That means there are no waves. You probably don't want this setting, but again, it's your render. You do with it what you like. Water visibility is how visible the water may be. If you want it very, very clear, you can go ahead and crank that up. That is how many blocks down the water looks like. If you don't want the water very clear, you can go ahead and set that to a lower amount. Water opacity is, again, how clear the water is. The water visibility is how deep you can see. The water opacity is how clear or cloudy that looks. We're going to go ahead and not make the water very deep, how far we can see it, but we're going to make it very, very opaque and nice and clear like glass. We're going to go ahead and use a custom watercolor. As you can see, I checked that little box right there. And we're going to go ahead and pick our watercolor. Now, this is very important. You may think that something like this would look very, very nice. I mean, that's a cool watercolor, am I right? We're going to go ahead and render that, and I will show you what that looks like. It is incredibly bright, almost looks like there's something wrong with the water. Again, if you like that color, that's fine, but if you want to do a realistic color, you want to do more gray and very, very dark. Let me show you what that looks like. You can go ahead and render that out. As you can see, that's looking a lot better. If you want even darker, you can go ahead and do that. Perhaps you want more gray. Go ahead and do that. And as you can see, that's looking pretty good for the watercolor. As you can see, I did a very dark and gray and somewhat blue watercolor. You can see here when I move my camera around. Hopefully we're not using too much of our CPU. As you can see, it's opaque, but it's reflective. If I go ahead and increase the water visibility, you will be able to see farther down, and eventually we should maybe be able to see the bottom. Maybe not. But regardless of that, aha, there we go. I had it wrong. If your opacity is less, that means that you will be able to see more into the water. If it's more, it gets incredibly cloudy. So you probably want something around there so you can see the bottom. That looks pretty good. But that is the water effects. We're going to go ahead and reset our render because we don't want that rendering. But yes, that is the water effects. We're going to be moving on right along here. Next up is camera. This is another very important tab that you're going to want to mess around with. Now, the first thing that I'm going to show you, we're not going to mess around too much with this. The only thing that I want you to worry about right now is the projection mode. Right now, we're on the standard projection mode. As you can see, this is pretty much looking what Minecraft looks like. If you want to do a render that looks a lot like this, let me find it. If you want to do a render that looks like this uses the parallel preset. Go ahead and select that from the drop-down menu. It is right there. Go ahead and select that, and it will load up what is called a parallel render. As you can see, this looks fantastic if you zoom in here using our mouse wheel and using our our keys on our keyboard again to move around. You can see this is those little model-looking shots that everybody so loves. If I go ahead and render that out, you can see that looks fantastic. That is the parallel view. There are other options here in the projection mode tab, fisheye, something that, you know, if you'd like to do, that's fine. But it's not my personal favorite. I don't use that too much. If we go ahead and load it up here, you can see it looks pretty cool. It's one of those interesting shots. Chunky gives you that option to do those interesting shots. But that is the parallel view. But today we're just going to be doing the standard view because that's what most people would like to do anyway. And that actually directly moves us onto these other options down here. Once our camera loads up again here, I want to go ahead and focus on a point of view. So say you want to do a nice blurred bokeh effect shot. If you go ahead and load up here, say, for example, next to this crane, you want to get this block right here, and you don't want to get anything else. You want to blur out the rest of the background. As you can see under the camera tab, go ahead and click autofocus. Autofocus will indeed blur out the rest of the background. And once it does that, you can see that everything else is blurred out. We're going to go ahead and start a render so I can show you what that looks like. And it does take a little bit because this is a pretty extreme effect. But as you can see, we are focusing on that block and everything else in the background is blurred out. You can go ahead and reset the render. If you want to fix your autofocus, go ahead and reset that. But basically, that's your autofocus. If you want to do a manual depth of field, you can certainly. You can go ahead and drag your depth of field slider down to where it gets correct. Oh, dear. Now, your subject distance, you do want to change that so you can figure out where your subject is. That's why the autofocus tab is great because it will autofocus, figure out where your subject is, and blur out the rest. That's something that if you want to do the bokeh effect, it looks very nice. That is pretty much it for the camera tab. I'm going to be moving right along here. The next tab that I want to show you is the entities tab. Now, As you can see, I've logged on to Greenfield. My entity, we're going to go ahead and jump around here. We're going to do player to camera. My entity should be, let me let it load here. As you can see, my entity is right there. This is my player model, and through the Entities tab, I can indeed move around and sort of position a cool character. This does not allow for animation, as some of you think that Chunky does. It simply allows you to pose your character in the shot. If I go ahead and render it out, you can see that now I have an entity, a Steve character, in my shot. Now, you can indeed select a skin. I don't exactly know where my skin is, but we're going to go ahead and try to find it. If I do find it, I'm going to be amazed. Go ahead and open it, and I believe that it will apply my personal skin to this character. Now, while we're waiting for that, all these settings down here will allow you to position your character. As you can see, now I have my character, and if I render that out, you can see that it's rendering, and I have a character in there. Really, really cool. If I want to adjust my head, I can use this drop-down menu to choose a part, and these parts are pretty self-explanatory. You can do the pitch, you can move this up and down, maybe if it finally loads, but this changes the pitch, the yaw, things like that. You just got to play around with that. You can see that I'm changing the roll. You can see I can move my head. If I want to do the yaw, you can see I can turn my head. Like if I want to do the pitch, you can see I can move my head up and down. It allows you to completely position every body part of your Steve character. That's pretty much it for the Entities tab. You can do gear. I'm not quite sure how to do that, unfortunately. Materials. This tab does unfortunately not work. As of now, it probably will in the future, but there is no current active development working on it. It basically allows you to set the emittance levels of different blocks, but we're going to go ahead and move on. Next up is post-processing. This tab you don't really want to mess too much with if you want to maybe bump up the exposure, but honestly, I would probably try to adjust that within the lighting tab, things like that, so you don't have to do any post-processing. Finally, the advanced tab. This basically allows you to set your render threads. Now, like I said, I do have a Core i7-9700K. That is an 8-thread processor, and because of that, I can only set my render threads to 8. CPU utilization, I did set that in the beginning of the video. That allows you to cap your CPU usage. I do have OBS running, and that is using a good amount of my processor, so I did cap it. That way I wouldn't have any encoding issues or anything like that. But normally, if I was rendering, I usually have it up to about maybe 80-85%. Set that at a good amount where your CPU doesn't get too hot, and you're able to do other tasks while you're rendering, but usually 85% is a good amount. Ray depth, that's something that is very important. This allows you to see how realistic and how many times a light particle bounces around inside your image. Now, if you have lots of glass or perhaps you have lots of water, you're going to want to crank this up kind of high. I don't recommend any more than like 10, because as you can imagine, the more a light particle is calculated bouncing around an image, this is how Chunky renders, the more a light particle bounces around in an image, the more your computer has to process that, and the more longer your render will take. It kind of sucks. Don't do something like 25. That's the maximum that it will go. Don't do something like that unless you want to wait a really, really, really long time. And after all, these things take a long time anyway, so you probably don't want to be waiting like months and months. Weeks and weeks. It's not months and months, it's weeks. Usually when I do a normal render, I usually have it around anywhere between 5 and 7. If I have a lot of glass, like I said, I want to do about 9 or 10, maybe even some water. But that's pretty much it for that. You can do the output mode. I think PNG currently is the only option, and that looks to be the case. Other than that, that's pretty much it for this tab over here. Next up is help. That helps you move around the camera. Move around the camera if you ever get confused. Finally, the moment of truth. We're going to go ahead and change our scene. Perhaps we have everything set up correctly. If you have everything set up to your liking, now we can finally go back and change our canvas size. We're going to go ahead and wait for that to process out. Now, while this is processing out, one thing that I do want you to know is that the bigger you make your image, the longer it takes Chunky to render. So this is currently 1920 by 1080p. This is full HD. It works. And if I try to go ahead and render this out, you saw how quickly my computer rendered the 400 by 400 square. But if you go ahead and look down in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see that it is rendering a lot slower than it was beforehand. If I make this 1440p, if you want to do a 1440p image, the dimensions are 2560 by 1440. Now I just press the X on my keyboard and I go ahead and click apply. This will make my render a 1440p image. As you can see, it's much more HD. And the bigger I make it, the longer it will take. As you can see, when I do make a 1440p image, if I go ahead and start that up, it does take a lot longer to render. You can go up to, as far as I know, 8K on Chunky, but just be warned, it takes a lot longer. 8K takes ages. As you can see, it is rendering out the 1440p image. We're going to go ahead and reset that. If you'd like to do 4K, the dimensions for that are 3840 by 2160. Go ahead and hit enter and it will make a 4K image. This is great for desktop backgrounds or anything like that. It will process through that. So just go ahead and wait for that to do that. As you can see, our image keeps upscaling. Now this will take 4 times as long as the 1080p image because 4K is 4 times bigger than 1080p. If you're pressed for time, I strongly recommend a 1080p image. If you'd like to go in between 1080p and 4K, I recommend 1440p. But as we're wrapping up this video, I'm just going to go ahead and set our render to 1080p and wait for that to process through. And once you have everything set up and everything is processed through, you can go ahead and start rendering it. Now, I strongly recommend letting this render out for about 1000 SPP. Now, what is SPP? SPP stands for samples per pixel. You can maybe see all this grain. All this grain is essentially your pixels. Now, the samples per pixel means that every time your CPU runs through the image, it will go ahead and sample out these pixels. This is a kind of a complicated process that I'm not going to be going very in-depth to today. But basically, this number is how many times your CPU runs through the image and processes it out. If you have it's set to 1000, that means your CPU will run through this image 1000 times to go ahead and process it out and make it look not as grainy. Now, something to note, the difference between 100 SPP and 1000 SPP, if we can go ahead and get it set here, is much greater than 1000 SPP and 10,000 SPP. The difference between the two images is going to be not that much different. So if you render it out to about 1000 SPP and it's still really, really grainy, you're not going to see much difference from like that to say like 20,000 SPP. Maybe if you let it render out to the maximum 99,000 SPP, you might see a difference, but that's just something to note. If your image is still grainy, there's not much that you can do besides just rendering it, letting it render out for huge amounts of time. But other than that, say you finally get your image positioned right and you want to go ahead and render that sucker out. Go ahead and hit the play button, and it will start to render out your image. I have been using this button quite often, but reset button, that resets your render to the scene to the viewpoint that you see here. This is the unrendered version. And once it starts rendering, you're going to want to let it sit for, well, however long it takes you to get to your target SPP, which can be set with this slider down here. If you are happy with the level of grain that is in your image, if it's not that much, or perhaps your render has reached the target SPP, you can go ahead up here and click Save Current Frame. Go ahead and click that, and it will allow you to bring up an option to save your current frame. We're going to save it to our Chunky tutorial folder, and I'm going to go ahead and look there. I'm going to go ahead and save that. Another thing that I want to show you really, really quickly is how to save this image as a whole. Go ahead and click up in the top left-hand corner, the little floppy disk icon. This will allow you to save your render, not the image itself, but in the progress that you have made. Go ahead and click Save, and it will make a scene directory for you to save. Go ahead and click OK. And it will allow you to save your render as titled. You can go ahead and change this title. Before you want to change your title before you save it. But as you can see, it's saving. And once it's saved, it will continue to render. This is great. Perhaps you need to shut down your computer and you're still rendering. You want to save it. And that will allow you to save your progress. And once you open Chunky back up, you'll want to press this icon and will allow you to choose your scene. Very similar to pretty much every other saving process out there. But we're going to go ahead and close down Chunky because that is pretty much it for the tutorial. If we go ahead and go over to our chunky tutorial folder, you can see that we have a saved image. Now this looks pretty silly, it's not that great, I didn't let it render for that long, but as you can see, this is pretty much what your final render looks like. As long as you save it as a picture, you can your render that you were setting up in Chunky will appear here. That is pretty much it for today's tutorial, guys. I really hope you enjoyed it. I do apologize for it being so long, but I wanted to go very much in depth for today's video, because I wanted to give you as many tips and tricks as possible. But as always, guys, thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave it down in the comments. But thank you guys so much for watching, and have just a wonderful, wonderful day.